Welcome to the Uranium Unleashed podcast. America imports 95% of its uranium. Roughly 27% of the enriched uranium flowing into U.S. reactors comes from Russia, and the waivers allowing that to continue expire in 2028. Section 232 has just designated uranium a national security asset. This is the supply emergency the market hasn't fully priced.
Yeah, and it is a massive structural emergency that, honestly, almost nobody's talking about right now.
Right, which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive for you today. We've got a huge stack of sources we're pulling from, recent market reports from Sprott, the Investing News Network, and Crux Investor.
We're also integrating those strategic briefs from the Atlantic Council and CSIS.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, hard data from the EIA, the Department of Energy, and those official declarations from the March 2026 IAEA Nuclear Energy Summit.
Right, so the mission today is basically to help you understand why the broader market is just totally unprepared for this looming 2028 supply cliff.
Yeah, and how these recent geopolitical moves are forcing like a multi-billion-dollar rewiring of the entire global energy grid. It's wild.
It really is. And to understand the panic that's starting to set in behind closed doors, we have to look at the demand side first. Because demand is just exploding.
Oh, absolutely. Let's start with the hype, right? In March 2026, you had the Nuclear Energy Summit in Paris wrap up, and 38 nations formally pledged to triple their nuclear capacity by 2050.
And they recently added some heavyweights to that list, too. China, Brazil, Italy, Belgium.
Yeah, so that policy momentum is actually translating into physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think there are 65 reactors actively under construction globally right now.
Which is a huge number. But, the real variable that has totally upended these demand models isn't even coming from the governments.
Right, it's a private sector.
Exactly, specifically Silicon Valley. They have entered this market in a very disruptive way.
Because the AI revolution is just so incredibly power hungry. Like, training these large language models takes exponentially more energy than traditional computing.
Right, and we're seeing data centers demand so much electricity that the tech giants are literally bypassing the traditional power grid. They're going straight to nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, you have Google partnering to restart the Duane Arnold reactor in Iowa specifically just to feed their AI infrastructure.
Well, and before we move past that, we should probably define what these tech companies are actually buying, because they aren't just buying electricity.
Right, they're buying baseload reliability.
Exactly. Wind and solar, they're intermittent, right. They generate power when the wind blows or the sun shines. But a data center running complex AI computations, it can't turn off.
No, it needs a 247 uninterrupted flow of massive power. And nuclear is, well, it's really one of the only carbon-free sources that provides that constant baseload.
And the financial markets are obviously reacting to this frenzy, this spot price of uranium.
And just to clarify for anyone who doesn't trade commodities, that's the price you pay for immediate delivery of the physical material right now, not years in the future.
Right, exactly. So that spot price, it hit $101.50 a pound back in January 2026.
Wow. Yeah, and it's currently sitting around $92 a pound. So the demand signal is flashing as brightly as possible.
But the thing is, that bright signal is completely blinding the market to this very sobering reality on the supply side.
Oh, completely. If you dig into the U.S. Energy Information Administration data, the EIA, the numbers are just staggering.
Okay, let's look at 2023.
Yeah, in 2023, the United States consumed 32 million pounds of imported uranium oxide just to keep its commercial nuclear fleet running.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there because I want to make sure I'm getting this baseline right. 32 million pounds just to maintain the current fleet.
Right.
That's before we even talk about tripling capacity for AI or anything. So how much of that did the U.S. actually dig out of its own ground that same year?
50,000 pounds.
Wait, really? I must be missing something. The U.S. has this massive landmass, a huge mining history. How is it physically possible that we imported 32 million pounds and only produced 50,000 domestically? It's crazy, but it comes down to a 640-to-1 import ratio. The U.S. imports roughly 95 to 99% of the uranium it needs just to keep the lights on.
That is wow.
Yeah, for decades, the global market was flooded with this really cheap uranium, heavily subsidized by foreign state-owned enterprises.
Or domestic U.S. mining just couldn't compete on price.
Exactly. It couldn't compete, so it effectively went dormant. The whole infrastructure just decayed.
Okay, let's unpack this for you with an analogy, because it's essentially like a country deciding to build the world's biggest, most advanced fleet of electric vehicles, right?
Right.
Only to realize at the very end of the assembly line that they don't manufacture a single battery.
That's exactly what it is.
You have machines, you have the soaring demand, but you completely lack the raw fuel to actually make them run.
And the vulnerability, it runs much deeper than simply having to import the fuel. The true danger is exactly who the West is importing it from.
Right.
And also the mechanical process that raw rock has to undergo before it can even be put inside a reactor core.
Because, yeah, you can't just blast uranium out of a mountain, throw it into a power plant, and expect it to generate electricity.
No, not at all.
The rock has to be processed, it has to be enriched, and this is where the geopolitical choke point really tightens.
Yeah.
Explain how that mechanism actually works.
Sure. So mining the uranium ore, that's really only step one. Natural uranium dug out of the earth contains less than 1% of the reactive isotope, U-235.
Okay.
So to make it usable for commercial power, you have to run it through this highly complex, fiercely expensive enrichment process.
Right.
You basically convert the solid uranium into a gas, and then you spin it in these massive centrifuges at supersonic speeds to separate and concentrate those fissile isotopes.
So it's basically separating the heavy, useless rock from the lighter, highly reactive material.
Precisely. And right now, Russia controls roughly 40 to 44% of the entire globe's enrichment capacity.
Which is terrifying.
It gets more shocking. If you look at the U.S. commercial reactors powering American cities today, about 27% of the enriched uranium actively flowing into those plants still comes directly from Russia.
Which just feels entirely counterintuitive, right, given all the massive geopolitical fracturing we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah.
But it gets significantly worse when we look at the future of this technology. We mentioned those 65 reactors being built globally, but the entire next generation of nuclear technology relies on small modular reactors, or SMRs.
Right, and they don't run on the standard fuel we've been using since the 1970s.
Exactly.
Traditional light water reactors use low-enriched uranium, LEU. That material is enriched to about, 3 to 5% concentration of U-235.
Right.
But these new, highly efficient, small modular reactors, they require a different fuel entirely. It's called 8-LEU high-assay low-enriched uranium.
And that requires a much higher concentration.
Yeah, that material needs to be enriched to between 5 and 20%.
So, to use a metaphor here, if standard LEU is the regular unleaded gasoline you put in your commuter car, HLEU is the high-octane jet fuel required to fly a supersonic jet.
That's a great way to put it. You simply cannot run the advanced machines on the cheap stuff.
And here is the critical structural vulnerability of this entire AI and nuclear renaissance. Russia currently holds a near monopoly on the commercial production of HALEU.
Right, a near monopoly.
So the very fuel required to power the next generation of Western nuclear innovation is controlled by a foreign adversary. That is just a massive blind spot.
It's a huge blind spot, and it brings us right to a policy cliff that is rapidly approaching.
Let's look at that timeline, because it's urgent. In August 2024, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act, H.R. 1042, was signed into law.
Right.
And it effectively banned Russian imports. But it granted these temporary waivers to keep U.S. reactors from shutting down, while utility companies desperately tried to find alternative supplies.
And those waivers expire in exactly 2028.
2028. And Moscow is fully aware of this leverage. I mean, in late 2024, they launched their own tit-for-tat export restrictions.
Yeah. The clock is ticking incredibly loudly right now. 2028 is not some distant, abstract policy goal. It is a hard, impending operational deadline.
Okay, so here's where I get genuinely confused. If the utility companies operating these power plants know this 2028 cliff is coming, why did that Sprott report highlight a 13-year streak of utilities under contracting for future uranium? Like, if you're a utility executive and you know your primary supplier is about to be cut off by federal law, why wouldn't you buy up everything you could from friendly nations? Why were they asleep at the wheel?
Well, we have to look at the psychology and the regulatory environment of these utility companies to understand why they just froze.
Okay.
Utilities are inherently slow-moving, intensely risk-averse entities. For over a decade, uranium prices were incredibly low.
Yeah.
Supply from places like Russia and Kazakhstan was cheap. It was abundant. So utility executives got comfortable buying their fuel on the spot market just in time, rather than signing those 10-year long-term contracts that actually fund new mines.
Ah, so they got addicted to the convenience of cheap, immediate delivery.
Exactly. Furthermore, utilities often paralyze themselves while waiting for absolute policy clarity from the government before making, multi-billion-dollar procurement decisions.
They waited to see if the import bans would actually stick.
Yeah, but by waiting, They missed the window to easily transition. They've now created this compressed, panicked 24-month window to somehow secure alternative, fully enriched fuel before those 2028 waivers definitively expire.
Okay, so the free market essentially failed here. The utilities blinked, hoping the problem would solve itself. So did the U.S. government just sit back and watch the clock run out on this 2028 deadline?
No, they realized they couldn't. They had to step in with emergency measures to force a domestic rebuild from the ground up. And this brings us to January 2026 and a massive shift in the policy architecture. President Trump declared a national energy emergency, invoking Section 232 to officially designate uranium as a national security asset.
And just to give you some context on how significant that mechanism is, Section 232 is the exact same legal lever used historically to protect the steel and aluminum industries.
Exactly.
By treating uranium as a national security asset, the federal government gains access to these sweeping executive powers.
Yeah.
And we really have to view this objectively as a continuum of policy, right? The Biden administration instituted the initial ban on Russian imports to cut off reliance, and then the Trump administration followed up with the Section 232 declaration to aggressively rebuild the domestic infrastructure required to replace those imports.
Right, and as part of that, the Department of Energy rolled out a staggering $2.7 billion investment to resurrect domestic uranium enrichment.
Which is huge.
It is, but the way they deployed that capital is what's truly fascinating. They didn't just hand a giant check to a single defense contractor. They deliberately diversified the technological risk to eliminate single points of failure.
Okay, walk me through where exactly this $2.7 billion went, because it sounds like they're treating this more like a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley than a traditional government bureaucracy.
They essentially are. So the funds were distributed across 4 distinct pathways. First, American Centrifuge Operating received $900 million.
Okay.
They use proven, highly reliable gas centrifuge technology. It's established, the physics are well understood, and it can scale predictably to produce that vital HALEU fuel for the advanced reactors.
Okay, so that's the safe bet. The technology we know works.
Exactly. Then Orano Federal Services also received $900 million. But their mandate is entirely different. They are focused on rapidly expanding conventional LEU production.
Got it.
The goal there is to ensure the existing fleet of traditional legacy reactors doesn't just go dark while we wait for the advanced SMRs to be built.
Covering the present while building the future. Makes sense.
The third major recipient is General Matter, which also secured $900 million. And this one is the absolute wild card.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they are developing a proprietary, highly confidential enrichment technology backed by heavy-hitting venture capital networks, including Peter Thiel's group.
Wow.
It is incredibly high risk, but if their underlying mechanics actually work, it promises massive improvements in energy efficiency and cost reduction compared to spinning giant metal centrifuges.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And there was one more smaller grant, right?
Yes. Global Laser Enrichment received a $28 million award to continue developing laser isotope separation.
Lasers.
Yeah, instead of using centrifugal force, this uses precisely tuned lasers to excite and separate the specific U-235 isotopes. It's early stage, but again, incredibly efficient if they can commercialize the physics.
Okay, so they are really spreading the bets. They're funding the proven centrifuges, they're funding the legacy fuel, and they're funding the high-risk lasers and proprietary tech, all to guarantee that at least one of these pathways scales to commercial viability before the 2028 waivers expire.
Exactly.
It's a brilliant risk mitigation strategy for the enrichment bottleneck. But, it brings us to a fundamental, inescapable physical limitation.
The rock.
Yes. You can build all the state-of-the-art multi-billion-dollar enrichment facilities you want. You can have the best lasers and the fastest centrifuges on the planet. But they are entirely useless if you do not have the raw uranium ore to feed into them.
You still need the rock. And the global upstream mining supply is tightening dramatically at the exact moment demand is spiking.
So where is the West actually going to get this material? Because looking at the data, the traditional global suppliers are suddenly playing hardball.
Oh, absolutely. Look at Kazakhstan. They currently produce roughly 38 to 43% of the global supply. They're basically the Saudi Arabia of uranium. Well, in late 2025, they enacted new subsoil laws that significantly tighten state control over future exploration and development. Their state-owned company, Kazatomprom, has explicitly stated they are prioritizing value over volume.
And why did they make that shift?
Because they realize they hold the geopolitical trump card. Rather than flooding the market with volume to keep prices low, they are intentionally restricting output to maximize the revenue for the reserves they have.
Wow.
They're leveraging their position to drain Western wallets.
And it isn't just strategic policy shifts either, right? It's outright geopolitical instability. Look at Niger.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
They've historically been a massive supplier of raw uranium to Europe, particularly to France's nuclear grid. But following a recent military coup, operations at key mines, like the Samar facility, have been completely halted.
Right.
You have extraction permits being unilaterally revoked and international disputes entirely freezing the supply. The West is realizing they just cannot rely on unstable jurisdictions anymore.
And this is driving a massive strategic pivot toward friendshoring and a desperate push for domestic revival. We are seeing unprecedented coordination among allied nations, specifically a group known as the Sapporo Five.
Which includes the U.S., Canada, Japan, France, and the U.K., right?
Correct. They are actively working to lock down supply chains entirely within friendly borders.
And Canada plays a massive role in this equation. If you look at the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan, the geology is almost a freak of nature. The grades of uranium there are practically unheard of.
Oh, they're incredible.
Like IsoEnergy's Hurricane deposit boasts an indicated resource grade of 34.5%.
And to put that 34.5% grade in perspective for you, in most parts of the world, mining companies are moving massive mountains of earth just to extract ore that contains less than 1% uranium.
Less than 1%.
Yeah. So when you have ore that is 34% pure, it completely breaks and reconstructs the economic model of a mine. It requires less capital, less digging, and gets to market much faster.
But even closer to home, the domestic revival inside the United States is finally gaining traction after decades of complete stagnation. So how is the U.S. actually planning to pull this rock out of the ground competitively?
The U.S. is attacking this through two primary mining methods. The first and most rapidly deployable is in situ recovery, or ISR.
Break down how ISR actually works mechanically, because it isn't what people picture when they think of a mine.
No, not at all. When most people picture mining, they picture massive open pits and giant dump trucks. ISR is completely different.
Okay.
A mildly alkaline or acidic solution is injected directly into a uranium-bearing aquifer deep underground. The uranium naturally dissolves into the liquid right there in the earth. Then that liquid is pumped back up to the surface, almost like a water well where the uranium is stripped out. It involves almost no moving of earth, has a vastly lower capital cost, and leaves a significantly smaller environmental footprint.
And this isn't just theory, right?
Yeah.
ISR now accounts for about 60% of global uranium output. Companies like Encore Energy are already operating ISR plants down in Texas, actively pulling uranium out of the ground today.
Yeah.
But ISR only works in very specific, highly permeable geological conditions.
Right. For the rest of the rock, you still need conventional mining.
Right. And that is where assets like Eagle Nuclear's Aurora project become critical. Located right on the Oregon-Nevada border, it currently holds the largest conventional indicated uranium deposit in the United States, sitting at 32.75 million pounds.
Which is substantial.
Projects of this scale are vital because they represent a massive, defined resource sitting squarely on American soil, entirely insulated from foreign geopolitical volatility.
Absolutely.
What I find fascinating about Eagle Nuclear is that they aren't just trying to be a traditional mining company. Historically, miners dig up the rock, sell it to the highest bidder, and utilities burn it. But Eagle is trying to build a vertically integrated platform. They want to pair their domestic uranium resource with exclusive small modular reactor technology. They want to own the entire life cycle, from the rock deep in the ground in Oregon all the way to the clean electricity hitting the commercial grid.
And that vertical integration represents a fundamental shift in how the financial markets are valuing these entities.
Yeah.
Companies with hard domestic U.S. exposure or those tightly integrated with Western enrichment supply chains, they're no longer being viewed by Wall Street as simple commodity plays.
They're more than that now.
They are being repriced and recognized as strategic national security assets. The underlying value of these companies isn't just tethered to the daily spot price of uranium anymore.
Right.
It's driven by the massive security premium of possessing a reliable domestic supply in an increasingly fractured global market.
So, bringing this all back to you, the listener, why should you care about uranium supply chains, Section 232 and the 2028 waiver cliff? Because whether you are wildly excited about the possibilities of the AI revolution, or deeply concerned about achieving global clean energy goals, or just watching the shifting tectonic plates of geopolitics, absolutely none of it functions without this single, heavily constrained element.
Exactly.
The stock market and the tech world have aggressively priced in the upside of this nuclear renaissance. They are cheering for the new reactors and the massive data centers. But they haven't yet fully priced in the reality of the supply emergency operating just beneath the surface.
And we need to consider a final implication here that pushes beyond the current market assumptions.
Okay, what's that?
We know the tech giants are desperate for this 247 power to maintain their AI dominance, and we know they're currently relying on slow-moving utilities and government-funded enrichment projects to secure the HLAU fuel for the next generation of reactors. But what happens if those domestic enrichment projects hit technological snags? What happens if the utility companies stumble again before that hard 2028 cutoff?
That would be a disaster.
It would. Given the trillions of dollars at stake in the AI race, will we see Silicon Valley simply bypass the traditional energy sector entirely? Will the tech giants begin using their massive cash reserves to outright buy the uranium mines and enrichment technologies, effectively privatizing and monopolizing the very foundation of the future energy grid?
Wow. That is a profound shift to consider. The entities controlling the data might soon control the atoms powering it. The market has priced in the nuclear renaissance. It has not yet priced in the nuclear supply emergency. This has been Uranium Unleashed. Stay informed. Stay ahead.